chapter. So the purpose of this mini lesson is to explain more about the logic of different sections of the methods chapter, and that can get a little confusing and hopefully help you understand why you need to include certain details so that you will know what to include and where. I want you to recall from the mini lesson, I believe in the second week of module 4, that the purpose of the methods chapter is to answer 5 big questions about your research. These are: what are the context of your study? Who are you studying and how did you determine who you are studying? In detail, and this is critical, what is your plan? What is your plan for collecting data? And what is your plan for analyzing data? And if you can, use some citations or use a valid method that's already been shown to work. Then the 4th question is the study ethical? Usually this is done in a single sentence that was approved by IRB, either by Edgewood or the institution that is ultimately taking responsibility. And then the 5th question is, what are the potential ways in which your data could become corrupted or invalid, and how do you plan to mitigate that situation? For today's mini lesson, we are going to focus on questions 1, 2, and 3. Before we get into that, I want to bring us back to our Gordian knot and specifically what we're calling strand 2. The second strand is really to demonstrate to the discipline that you are a peer, and it is also to prove to the discipline that you have fully taken into account all the aspects of your research design and have designed a study that you can conduct with what we call fidelity, so that you produce results that are valid, reliable, and actually are appropriate for answering your research question. And that's really the most critical. Is what you're planning to do actually going to get you results that you can analyze, that you can actually say, hey, this is helping me understand this research question? If not, that's not a valid study, okay? To meet these expectations of strand 2, there are a couple rules that you should assume your audience knows nothing. Of course they do, but assume that they don't. You need to explain every single step that you are taking. And why? Because your audience will likely actually be discipline experts, and they need to know that you know what you are doing. So that's really what they're looking for. Not only that the plan is a solid plan, but that you know what you're talking about. So that's part of why you need to be so explicit in the methods chapter. And then our second rule is that you need to justify each of those steps. And the way you do that is to relate your justifications, back to your research question. Because your audience, again, is looking for that validity in your methods. In other words, how will your methods that you are employing be well suited to actually answering your research question? Is what you're doing going to produce the results that you need? Okay, let's get into some specifics. Let's start with the section that is the context of your study. The context of your study is really the background about the setting and demographics that you need to include that could influence your study and affect the conclusions you come up with when you are discussing your data. So, for example, my dissertation was about a major curricular and pedagogical intervention in a large undergraduate human anatomy course at an R1 institution in the upper Midwest. So what I did was I briefly, because it wasn't a huge part of my study, discuss the urban center that the university is located in, the demographics of the city and the county that it's located in. And then I discussed in general the demographics of the undergraduate population of the school, because the sample that I'm using might be not as reflective of the school overall. So I want to be able to show that those two things are different. And it's good to include those demographics generally. So then I got into, in that context section, explaining the specific demographics of the classes that I was studying, including the age range of the students, because I thought that might make an impact, the year in school of the students, because I thought their academic maturity might make a difference, their majors or areas of study, as well as what the students intend to do with their educational trajectories after taking the class. So many of these students are majoring in things like toxicology or pre-nursing or any of the allied healthcare professions. And their trajectory is that they plan to go into nursing or doctor of physical therapy or those kind of careers. I also shared some historical data. And again, this is all very data driven. This isn't just, hey, I think this is what's happening. I can prove it with the numbers, right? So I shared some historical data, including how the course was structured prior to the redesign and how well the students typically did in that course based on looking at the statistics of the DFW statistical analysis, or D's, W's, and withdrawals from the class. And that is accessible through the university and its public record. I thought that might be important because the makeup of the students of this class means that they typically perform well on the summative assessments, which I thought going forward could impact how well one of my measurements tools would be able to pick up subtle differences. You also might be collecting data from across multiple contexts, so multiple institutions, multiple places, multiple people in different settings. I think it's important, it is important to talk about each of those contexts and provide the same type of data for each to see what the similarities and differences are, because those differences could impact the way you interact with your sample. So as I alluded to, don't at this point make any assertions or assumptions about how context matters. You don't need to do that. You're just providing facts. Don't need to have all the facts right now. You can always come back as your analysis develops, as your chapter 4 develops and your chapter 5 discussion develops further on. And you can include demographic information or contextual information later to help the reader understand the data that came out or the analysis, and to help the reader understand the conclusions that you're drawing from that. I'd like us to look at another example from Dr. Heather Harbach. So let me pull that up. Okay, I believe you can all see this section. Now, Dr. Harbach called this setting instead of context. And part of that is because it's not just the context, but the setting in which her study is situated in, and the way students are interacting with that setting is really, really important for her study. So she calls it setting instead of context. You can change the headings to fit what is appropriate for the background information that you are sharing. But let's look at what Dr. Harbach does here to set the setting. And it is a very long section because, again, setting matters. So we'll just look at a few details here. First, as you probably know, you don't use the name of the institution or place or anything that could be an identifier because of FERPA. You notice that the way she describes it, Emma, is that this is a 4-year public university located in a large urban Midwestern city. She didn't note if it was an R1 or liberal arts or what have you, but you could probably tell from the demographics she chooses later on. So then she goes on to say that this institution is combined undergraduate and graduate. The enrollment was, you can see here, 27,146 in-state students were the majority of this. Because this is this setting, she needs to give a little background information, not even a little, but really describe the setting in which this institution is located, because it's the interaction of students within this setting that is the context for her study, the most important part of her study. So she goes on to say, campus is actually surrounded by neighborhoods with people who are not part of the campus, long-term residents and student renters. And as you can see here, this dissertation is actually about student behavior, but a lot of this is alcohol related fueled weekend activities. She notes here, this is interesting because I think she's going to be discussing alcohol and how the interplay of how it causes student behavior, that she wants to really emphasize that the city and state is known for its culture of beer and focus on alcohol. And then she goes on to discuss that a bit further. Further down, she talks a bit about the offices that are going to address student behavior and gives them a little bit of information about what those offices are. So there are two primary offices that address these behaviors: University Housing and the Dean of Students Office. And at MU, this institution, the student conduct policies and procedures, the code of conduct, are codified by the state. So this is a state institution, although she did not mention that it was a state institution. She does here, and that's important. And that code of conduct, this is critical here, is that it governs both behavior on and off campus, with the primary responsibility of adjudication falling to the Dean of Students. So again, we're giving the background and the context in which behavioral issues are taking place. So I'll leave it at that for this part of the paper. For this part of Dr. Harbach's dissertation. We're going to revisit other sections of it as well. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the discussion of the sampling method that you're using. So let me pull up our dissertation template and share that with you. And I want to point out where it's kind of in parentheses on our template, so it looks like it's not as important as other things, what we need to do there. Okay, so let me pull that up and let me share my screen. Okay, I think you can all see this at this point, and you can obviously refer to this on your own version of the template. But when we're talking about study participants and data sources, one of the first things we talk about is our sampling methods. Now here, kind of say here that you need to include the number of anticipated participants. That seems kind of obvious, including your participant or data source selection process. Okay, so that's your sampling method. And your sampling method could be I'm sorry, I know how to say this, but you can see it. Purposive sampling methods, convenience sampling, theoretical sampling, diversity sampling. There's a whole bunch of very legitimate sampling methods. And then we are supposed to use inclusion and exclusion criteria. All that seems pretty straightforward, right? But I want to go into that sampling method a little bit more, because I'd argue that you actually need to describe why you are using a certain sampling method. And here's why. And really think through this. Basically, there's an underlying assumption, and remember, this goes all the way back to the history of the dissertation and where this format emerged from in the social sciences, that there is a basic underlying assumption that random sampling from a population would be best, whether it is qualitative or quantitative. Now, that is, first of all, not always a perfect thing to do when you're doing qualitative, and there's reasons for that, and you can explore those. But also, let's be real, it's near impossible to do that type of research, collect that level of population and do a random sampling from that population, unless you have a team of TAs and a large research grant. And unless you know something I don't, most of you do not have that access. I didn't, and most dissertators would not. So you'll need to explain why your sampling method will still get you the type of participants and that you need to answer your research questions. Again, the way we do that or justify that is grounding that in your research question. Why will this method still get you the stuff that you need? And if you add a reference, this is a big bonus. It would be great if you could really justify this, not only by relating it back to your question, but also showing in the literature that this is an appropriate method to use, either an example that somebody's already done, or somebody from a reference or research expert, like a manual or handbook, saying this is okay. All right, so let's look at what Dr. Harbach did in her section. So Dr. Harbach starts by saying a purposeful sampling technique was used. Participants included those who responded to research invitations letters. And she goes on to state that, in using Creswell as a reference, that purposeful sampling when conducting qualitative research, where participants are selected who will best help the researcher understand the problem and the research questions. So she's saying, hey, this expert said this is an okay method to use because it's going to help me get the exactly right people that I need for this qualitative study. Okay, so that is what Dr. Harbach does. And you can see how well that explains, even just in a really short way, why she's doing purposeful sampling. Finally, I want to discuss both the data collection and data analysis plan in more depth. For example, you'll need to specifically explain, if you're using interviews will help you explain your questions, answer your research questions, or why running t-tests, if you're doing quantitative or regression analysis, are going to actually help you answer your questions. Like I mentioned before, in these sections, use references to justify your choices. Don't just make up the steps. Look for published works, either in reference materials or handbooks on how to conduct certain methods, and follow those same exact steps. That is how we, even though we don't necessarily discuss it in a qualitative study, that is how we achieve reliability, by using methods and following the recipe that others have laid out for us, okay? So let's first talk about the section on data collection. If you are doing a quantitative dissertation, you should be able to explain why the test or tests you are running are appropriate for answering your type of research question. And you can find these justifications all over the place, unless you're running something super advanced. Usually you can find them in a statistical textbook or manuals like Palant's SPS Survival Guide. There's some other references if you want materials that I have because I needed a lot of help in that area that I'm happy to share with you if you need a little bit more help on how to write about those. But that's also kind of the same idea if you're doing qualitative, which most of you in this class are this time around. You should be able to justify why the method you are choosing will help you answer your specific research questions. And yes, you'll also want to include a reference or two to support that. But the argument can't just be that, for example, Saldanis said a case study was appropriate for answering questions about X and just leave it at that. You need to go a little bit further and develop that a little bit further. And so rather than just stopping at, hey, Saldanis said it was good, you have to say, because, and there should be a because clause either to that sentence or further along in that paragraph. Why did Saldanis say it, and why is it appropriate to your study using what Saldanis said or whomever you're referencing? Okay, let's go back to Dr. Harbach's dissertation and take a look at that section. Okay, so Dr. Harbach starts with noting that interviews are the primary data collection tool utilized in this study. And she goes on to say why. Interviews allowed participants to share information with the researcher in a natural setting of their choice and allowed the research to talk directly to people and see them behave and act within their context. And she attributes that to Creswell. And she goes further to explain what that means by saying that Creswell, again, referencing Creswell, indicated that the research is the primary instrument. So there is no protocol necessarily, there's no survey in this type of research, allowing him or her to gather the information instead of relying on previously used research instruments, okay? So although we're not using, in this way, we're not using a validated method, this method in and of itself is valid because of this. So that's why we have to include this information. Further along, so Dr. Harbach then adds a little bit more information about the interviewing as a process and why interviewing is, and relates this back to why interviewing is appropriate for this group of, this sample of parents, this population of parents that she samples from. Okay, so that's what the next part of those paragraphs are. And then she gets down to talking a little bit about how to do the interviewing and what is the theory and philosophy behind that process. And she references Seidman. So she goes on to say, Seidman described interviewing or phenomenologically based interviewing is Sunday morning. My mouth is trying to work. As including open-ended questions that build on each other with a goal for participants to reconstruct his or her experience of the topic within the study. And then she goes on to say, he stated that there are a wide range of adaptable topics to the interview, covering almost any issue involved in the experience of contemporary people. So the rest of this paragraph is where Dr. Harbach explains more about how to use the interview approach, and why we are using this interview approach. So she gets it set up. She's setting herself up to say, okay, these people said this was okay, and this person said this is how we are supposed to do it, so that later on she can talk about her actual protocol, which is what she does in this section. And beginning here, she'll start talking about the exact way she is crafting these questions. And you can see that she really lays it out so detailed in a bulleted list. Okay, so that is her precursor to how she's going to be talking about data collection. Okay, I'm not actually going to talk about the data collection from Dr. Harbach's dissertation, because it's a little different than other data collections I've seen for a very good reason. Dr. Harbach had a challenge because she needed to both keep the privacy of the participants, who are parents, private and anonymous. She also needed to make sure she wasn't violating FERPA because she is studying adult students. And so she goes on to discuss what a gatekeeper does and how she got this gatekeeper and how that they clean the data before she saw it. So it doesn't necessarily, because it's a very specific circumstance, I don't necessarily want to use that as an exemplar for what we're talking about today. So I will stop for that section. I will say that when you do get to data collection, that you will also need to reference and include in your appendices any interview or survey protocols and discuss why the specific questions that you are using align with your research questions. Again, justifying, is the question I'm asking really going to help me answer my research question? If you are using a survey protocol that has been validated or a measure that has been validated, that's wonderful, that's great. You don't need to It's great if you have those. It's not necessary, but you still need to justify why that validated protocol helps you answer your specific research questions. Why are you using that? All right, the final section that we are going to focus on today is the data analysis section. And regardless of whether you are doing qualitative or quantitative, each method has a recipe for you to follow. Each quantitative test has a set of standards and a protocol that you follow to run those tests. And that is the same for qualitative. So first thing that you need to do is explain the steps in your recipe and your data analysis recipe. How are you going to go about analyzing that data? So for example, I am currently doing a study that is using a methodology called a concept analysis. And that method is that that the team of us are analyzing different uses of a similar concept across literature. Now, we're not just like saying this is how we're going to do it. There are actual studies and methods that have been showing to be validated that help us guide how we are going to do this analysis across the research. And for this, the concept analysis actually has 8 steps. So what I will need to do, and our writers will need to do, is explain what happens in each of those steps, why that step helps us understand and understand how different terms are being used across the literature. And then we will go on to explain how we performed each of those steps. So we set up spreadsheets, we split up the reading, we created a way to code the data. We are going to explain all of that in our plan. Now, this isn't a dissertation, so we don't need to write a research plan, but we will need to explain that when we write the paper. Now, for quantitative, you'll explain in detail the process that you did to clean the data, the descriptive statistical steps that you'll run to ensure that you can use the actual analytical test that you want to or intend to use, as well as any tests you need to do to manipulate the data so that it is usable or to explain some anomalies in your data. That's all something that Dr. Lee can help you with if you need a little bit more, or again, I have some textbooks and references that I'm happy to share names with for you to borrow if you're doing quantitative. Regardless, I think it would be great for you to find an example and skim some examples of chapters 3 thoroughly, so you can see how others describe their plans. And the cool thing about that is there's not that much variation in the way we do things when it comes to actually detailing the methods or the data analysis plan. So you can kind of follow the same procedures that they did. And you can borrow language. Obviously we don't steal language, but you can look at how people talk about different steps in their data analysis process to help you understand how to talk about your own. Now, I know that at this point you are obviously making a plan and not describing what you did. And that's because you haven't done anything yet. But as you can see, you can still describe basic theory and use those references and really think through the steps in your data collection and data analyses plan, even if you haven't done those things already. All right, so thank you for sticking with me this week. I want to make sure that the draft of your methods chapter is as robust at this point in your journey as it can be. As always, I recognize that you and your development is a unique thing, and where you are in your study process and development process may be different than others. This is totally a process of scaffolding and building. So I say most of us are done framing our houses at this point. And this is the point in the methods section. We're adding the plumbing and the electricity, maybe even doing a little of our sheetrocking. But none of us at this point, anybody who's ever written a dissertation, should feel that we are move-in ready yet. So again, this is an iterative process, and we're getting basically your house in order so you can continue to build on it. All right, have a great week. Thanks for sticking with me. I know this was a bit longer than these usually are, but I hope it was helpful. And I hope that you take the time to really go back to your methods and make sure you're including all the things that you need to include in a really explicit way.